Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a plant that turns off something you've had your entire life. Your inside voice, the one that keeps track of things, that quietly tells you where you are, who you are, what's real and what isn't. Most of the time, you don't notice it. It just runs in the background. But once it's gone, you notice everything else. Because without it, there's nothing left to compare against. You can be walking down a street that doesn't exist, following instructions from someone who isn't there, completely certain you've always been doing exactly this. No hesitation, no confusion, just a steady, calm acceptance that this is how things are now. And for a while, it works. Tonight, we're tracing how a plant learned to switch that voice off, and what happens to a person when nothing is left to question what's happening. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's the thing about Datura. You don't know anything is wrong. That's the first thing to understand. That's the only thing, really. You're in your apartment. The evening is normal. You've made tea. The light through the window has that particular quality it has at this hour. Slightly yellow, slightly soft, and your phone is somewhere nearby, and everything is where it should be. Your friend Marcus is there. He's sitting in the chair you keep by the window, the one with the slightly broken armrest you've been meaning to fix, and he's telling you something. A story about work, something mildly funny. And you're laughing in the right places, and the tea is warm, and everything is completely fine. It is 8:30 on a Tuesday. You don't notice when the light changes. You don't notice when Marcus stops being someone you could call and becomes someone you can't, for a reason that hasn't occurred to you to consider. You reach for a cigarette from the pack on the table. You find the pack. You pull one out. You feel it between your fingers, the slight give, the paper, the weight of it, and you light it. And the first exhale is that specific small pleasure it always is, and you keep talking. The cigarette isn't there, the pack isn't there, the lighter isn't there. You're holding nothing. You've been holding nothing for an indeterminate amount of time, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 3 hours, performing the entire ritual of smoking in such perfect sensory detail that there is not one neural signal in your body suggesting this is not happening. Marcus says something, and you laugh. Marcus is not there. You do not know that you went outside. This is information that will reach you later, through a process of reconstruction from sources other than yourself. A text message you sent that reads like it was composed by someone trying to transcribe a dream. The small fact that your shoes are muddy and you have no memory of putting them on. You do not know that you had a conversation with the woman from upstairs, an extensive conversation apparently about her cat, who died 2 years ago, in the middle of the stairwell at 2 a.m, and that she came to check on you the following afternoon because something about your eyes had alarmed her enough to knock. Your eyes were the size of dinner plates. They would stay that way for 3 days. The pupil dilation is how people know. You didn't know you'd taken anything. You certainly didn't feel like you'd taken anything. But the eyes tell the story your brain can no longer tell about itself, and when your roommate comes home and finds you in the kitchen, confidently making a meal that involves only the counter and your hands moving over nothing, and she asks if you're all right, and you say yes, absolutely fine, just making dinner. The eyes are already the answer. She calls someone. You tell her that's not necessary. You tell her this clearly, calmly, with the complete authority of a person who is totally in control and has absolutely no reason to involve anyone else. And this is the moment that becomes the story people tell later, because your certainty was so perfect, so untroubled, that it had its own strange dignity. You were completely wrong. You were perfectly sure about it. The recovery happens in stages. First, the delusion clears and you are back. You feel entirely normal. You are aware, present, yourself. You tell your roommate that you feel much better now, thank you. and you can see she looks relieved, and you go to sit down on the couch, and then you wake up again, later. Which means the first waking was also inside it. Some people report 3 or 4 cycles of this. Surfacing into what feels like normalcy, living inside that normalcy for an hour or a day, and then surfacing again into a reality that is further from the last one and correspondingly more disorienting. The layers do not always announce themselves. You find out what you did the way you find out what happened at a party you don't remember attending. From other people, from evidence, from the quiet horror of recognizing shoes you don't remember putting on. The worst part isn't what happened. The worst part is that while it was happening you felt entirely fine. That's the drug. That's always been the drug. This is a drug that removes your reality and replaces it completely, with a version that has all the resolution, all the texture, all the sensory specificity of the original, and 0 of the mechanisms that might tell you something has changed. Other drugs know you've taken them. LSD comes with a calling card. The walls breathe, the colours shift. There's a quality to the light that isn't right, and somewhere underneath the strangeness your sober self is watching and knows it's watching. Mushrooms give you a similar grace. The world goes strange and you go strange with it, and there is almost always some part of you that understands this is temporary, that the visuals are the drug talking, that you will come back. MDMA makes you love people more than usual, and you probably know you love them more than usual, which is part of the experience. Ketamine makes you feel like your body is somewhere slightly different from where you left it. Noticeable. Even heroin at sufficient dose presents itself as unmistakably not sober. Your lungs work slower. The world recedes. There's a quality to the nod that announces itself. Datura doesn't do that. Datura goes into the department of your brain that decides what's real and quietly replaces the entire staff while the building keeps running. The receptors it targets are responsible for memory formation, for integrating sensory input with conscious attention, for maintaining the thread of what's happening. Block those receptors sufficiently and the brain doesn't become confused. It becomes confident. It doesn't reduce its output. It replaces it. It fabricates with complete fidelity the texture of ordinary life, the weight of a cigarette, the face of a friend, the specific quality of late afternoon light through a window, and presents it without caveat. You don't feel different. You feel normal. You're not normal. But you'll never know that from the inside. Not while you're in it. Not during. The knowledge, if it comes after. From other people, from evidence, from the muddy shoes. The plant responsible for all of this blooms at night. Large white flowers, trumpet-shaped, hanging downward, opening after dark and closing before morning like something that prefers not to be watched. It grows on every inhabited continent. Roadsides, vacant lots, abandoned fields, the margins of things. It does not require good soil or careful attention, or any particular climate beyond temperate to warm. It has established itself in North and South America, Europe, Asia, Africa and Australia, not because anyone planted it there, but because it is extraordinarily good at being a weed. The spiked seed pods, which look, if you're being honest, like something from a horror film's prop department, catch on clothing and animal fur and distribute themselves widely and without apology. The flowers smell faintly wrong in a way that's hard to describe, the way certain things smell wrong without smelling, specifically of anything bad, and the smell apparently does not deter insects from visiting and dispersing pollen, which is the only constituency Datura is actually trying to serve. Every part of it is toxic. Root, stem, leaf, flower, seed. The whole plant, top to bottom, is saturated with the same alkaloids, in concentrations that vary between individual plants, between different parts of the same plant, between different seasons, between a plant growing in one soil and an identical-looking plant growing 3 feet away. There is no reliable dose. There has never been a reliable dose. This is not a problem the plant considers itself to have. The active compounds are scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine, 3 tropane alkaloids that all target the same receptor system in the brain, the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and in doing so produce what physicians now call the anticholinergic toxidrome. Dilated pupils, dry mouth, flushed hot skin, elevated heart rate, urinary, retention, confusion, and, in sufficient quantity, a complete and seamless detachment from consensus reality. The pupils are the giveaway. They dilate to enormous size and stay that way for days, sensitive to light, wide and dark, unresponsive to brightness in the way that pupils normally are. Atropine, one of Datura's alkaloids, is still used by ophthalmologists today to dilate pupils for examination. In a medical context, this is useful and reversible. In the context of having accidentally eaten half a plant, it is terrifying. The eyes tell you what the person cannot. The Aztecs called it toloach. The Chumash of California called it momoy. In Sanskrit it is Datura, and it sits in temple offerings at the feet of Shiva, god of destruction and transformation, because whoever first categorized this plant understood that these two things are the same. In English it has a dozen names, none of them reassuring. Devil's trumpet, hell's bells, thornapple, devil's weed, stinkweed, and, in one specific context we'll get to shortly, Jimson weed, which is short for Jamestown weed. And the story behind that name is one of the more comedically specific incidents in early American colonial history. The earliest cultures that used Datura with any regularity understood something that later generations would keep forgetting and relearning. It was not casual. Among the Chumash people of what is now California's central coast, Datura ceremonies, the momoy ritual, were handled by specialists. Not curious participants, not seekers looking for an interesting evening. Trained individuals who had spent years learning exactly how much of the plant could be administered to a person of a given size and disposition without crossing from vision quest into medical emergency. The distinction, apparently, was not always maintained. Boys going through puberty rites might spend 3 days under its influence, in a state that everyone around them understood was dangerous, being watched by people whose sole job was to make sure they came back. Not every ceremony used the same dose, not every boy came back the same. This was not considered a flaw in the ritual, it was considered the ritual. The plant was not thought of as safe, it was thought of as powerful, which is a different category entirely, and one that the cultures who used it had, at minimum, the intellectual honesty to acknowledge. Among the Zuni, Datura was also used for healing and divination, specifically by rain priests, who would consume it before performing ceremonies intended to cool water. The logic was consistent across cultures. The plant could access something ordinary consciousness could not. What it accessed was understood to be real. What it cost was understood to be real. Both of these things were considered acceptable parts of the transaction. The Aztec used it differently. Toloach had a ceremonial role, yes, but it also appeared in contexts that were less spiritually elevated. There are accounts, not flattering to anyone involved, of it being administered to people who had not agreed to the experience as a form of punishment or humiliation. The Aztec understanding of the plant was sophisticated enough to include the observation that being made to be confused and terrified in public was not an experience people enjoyed. This is a kind of expertise. There is a meaningful difference between this is dangerous but we understand the danger and we approach it with appropriate gravity, and this looks like it might be interesting, let me eat some. Datura has been on the receiving end of both of these approaches for 3,000 years. One of them tends to go better. Across the Pacific Ocean and several thousand years of parallel development, the same plant, or close enough, was arriving at an entirely different set of conclusions in South Asia. In India, Datura stramonium and Datura metal have a history as long as any substance on the subcontinent. Datura appears in Sanskrit texts. It shows up in Ayurvedic medicine as an antispasmodic, an anesthetic, a treatment for respiratory diseases. Smoke the leaves to open the airways, apply the extract to ease a spasm. The compound is real, the application is real, and the dosing was, well, approximate. What Datura was not in India was neutral. Hindu tradition places it explicitly in the domain of Shiva, the destroyer, the transformer, the god who lives in cremation grounds and wears serpents and is simultaneously the most terrifying and most beloved figure in the pantheon. Datura flowers are offered at Shiva temples. The plant appears in his iconography. The association is not incidental. It is, as associations go, extremely on point. The god of endings and transformations gets the plant that ends your Tuesday and transforms it into something you'll never be able to account for. Shiva's plant is the one that takes your ego and shows you what's left. Whether that is something you wanted to know is technically optional. Some of Shiva's sadhus, the wandering ascetics who define their devotion partly through physical extremity, consume Datura as part of their practice. Small amounts, in context, understood within a tradition that had been figuring out this particular problem for centuries. This is not a story about recklessness. It is a story about a culture that had built an entire theological scaffold around the experience this plant produces and had the wisdom, at least in the institutional version, to treat that scaffold with appropriate seriousness. And then there is the other use. The same plant, the same alkaloids, the same effect that made it a spiritual tool also made it efficient at something else entirely. A person who has consumed Datura is compliant, amnesiac, functionally incapable of mounting any resistance or even forming a clear account of what is happening. The records of colonial India document this use with grim bureaucratic thoroughness. It went into food, it went into drinks, it was used by robbers, by poisoners, by people with specific and non-spiritual reasons to want someone else to spend the next day having no idea what occurred. The British colonial administration in India documented a criminal organisation, the Thuggee, which is where English gets the word thug, that used Datura as a preparatory step before robbery and, in the worst cases, murder. The operational logic was clean in the way that terrible things sometimes are. Incapacitate the target, take what you need, leave. The target would have no coherent account of what happened. Their memory would be a complete void. There is never a reliable witness. That is the whole point. The sacred and the criminal were, in this case, the same pharmacology. One of Datura's consistent qualities across every culture that has ever encountered it is that it does not particularly care which framework you bring to it. The plant arrived in Europe, sometime in the early modern period or possibly earlier. The historical record on this is somewhat murky, partly because the related Solanaceae family had always been present in European witchcraft tradition, and partly because the people who kept the most detailed records of its use were not generally the people using it. They were the people interrogating the people using it. This is where the story gets genuinely strange. Medieval and early modern Europe had a concept called the Witches' Sabbath. This was, in the accounts that survive, mostly from Inquisition records, which is a problematic source in ways that barely need stating, a gathering in which witches flew through the air to meet with the devil, participated in elaborate ceremonies, danced in ways considered theologically problematic, and generally got up to the kind of business that the church found it professionally necessary to address with fire. The confessions describing these events were detailed, specific, convincing enough to be taken as evidence of things that actually happened, by inquisitors who were, in their own way, doing their jobs. The accused women, in many cases, genuinely believed they had happened. They were asked, "Did you fly?" And they said yes. They described the sensation with precision. The rushing air, the height, the movement, the arrival at the gathering. They described the Sabbath itself with the confident specificity of eyewitness testimony. Who was there, what was said, what the devil looked like. The inquisitors wrote all of this down. Here is what the flying ointment was made of. Datura, belladonna, henbane, mandrake, all of them solanaceae, all of them containing the same tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, atropine, and their close relatives, all of them producing at appropriate dosage exactly the same anticholinergic syndrome. The seamless delirium, the convincing hallucinations, the flying sensation, which is, it turns out, a well-documented effect of this specific class of compounds, and the complete inability afterward to distinguish between what happened and what the brain fabricated. The ointment was applied to the body. Absorbed through the skin, the compounds entered the bloodstream. What the women experienced was real to them. What the inquisitors recorded was a pharmacological event. The Sabbath confessions were real experiences. They were not supernatural events. They were Datura's mechanism, interpreted through a theological framework by people who had absolutely no other framework available. Described to inquisitors who were themselves operating within that same framework, and written down as evidence of crimes that were, in the most literal sense, chemically induced. The inquisitors who recorded the flying were, without knowing it, conducting one of history's most thorough unintentional documentation projects on anticholinergic delirium. The women who reported flying genuinely believed they had flown. They were absolutely certain. They were not wrong about the certainty. They were wrong about the flying. This is the pattern. This is always the pattern. The medieval woman who flew to the Sabbath was certain. The Shumish boy who met the spirit world was certain. The Shiva devotee who crossed into the divine was certain. You in the apartment on Tuesday were certain. Every one of them was the most convinced person in the room. They were inside a drug that had removed the capacity to know they were inside a drug, and replaced it with an experience so convincing, so dense with ordinary sensory detail, that there was simply nothing within their reach to check it against. No seam, no flicker, no moment where the resolution went wrong. Just life, continuing exactly as life continues, in the untroubled way of a thing that doesn't know it has been replaced. The question wasn't whether they believed it. The question was never whether they believed it. They believed it completely. They believed it with the full confidence of a person who is standing in their own kitchen on a Tuesday evening, making dinner, watching their roommate come home. Absolutely fine. The question is always what happens to all of that certainty once they come back. Because they do come back. Mostly. They surface through layers of false waking, or they wake suddenly and cleanly, or they come to in a hospital with a doctor holding a small light to their enormous, unresponsive pupils. And then someone who was there for the part they were absent for has to explain what happened, and that person cannot explain it in full, because they were watching from outside, and the inside is gone. The experience cannot be retrieved. The memory was never written. Whatever happened in there, whoever was visited, whatever was said, whatever small domestic ritual was performed for hours in an empty room, is gone. Not suppressed, not inaccessible. Gone. The brain was occupied during the time that would normally have been used for encoding what's happening. It was busy fabricating something else. You have been told you were fine, you were not fine. You have been told you seemed normal. You did not seem normal. You have been told you talked to people, moved through rooms, responded to questions, performed actions with complete confidence and evident purpose. You remember none of it. This is Datura. This is, as best as anyone has ever been able to determine, what it has always been. And in the mid-17th century, across an ocean, a group of British soldiers were about to discover all of this in the most accidentally documented way possible. The history of what happens next to the plant as it crosses an ocean, as Europeans encounter it in the Americas, as a cook in colonial Virginia looks at a weed and thinks, "That looks like it might boil up nicely," begins where it always begins with this story. With people who were absolutely certain they knew what they were dealing with, the plant was already in the ground in a field that would later be part of Jamestown, Virginia, and a cook was about to look at it and think, "That looks like it might be edible." It is 1676, and someone in colonial Virginia is about to make a salad. This is not a metaphor. Robert Beverley, writing about the incident in his 1705 History of Virginia, describes what happened with the specific, slightly appalled precision of a man who was not there but spoke to people who were, and who understood that what he was recording was both a significant historical event and an extremely funny story about soldiers. Beverley was the kind of historian who occasionally let his astonishment run just slightly ahead of his neutrality, and in this case the astonishment was entirely justified. British troops had been dispatched to Jamestown to suppress Bacon's rebellion, a colonial uprising that was, by the standards of colonial uprisings, fairly standard in its causes and fairly chaotic in its execution. Nathaniel Bacon had organised a force of colonists and indentured servants against the colonial governor William Berkeley. Berkeley had fled. The Crown was displeased. Soldiers were sent. They arrived. They needed to eat. Someone looked at the local vegetation, identified what appeared to be edible young shoots growing in abundance, and boiled them. The shoot in question looked, to an English eye unfamiliar with the local flora, like something that might reasonably be a vegetable. The English eye was wrong. The plant was Datura stramonium. What followed was documented in enough detail that you can almost picture Beverley's face as he wrote it down. The soldiers spent 11 days in a state of complete delirium. Not drunk, not sick, not incapacitated in any of the familiar military ways. They were present, active, engaged, in a different world. They blew feathers into the air. They kissed and fawned upon each other with a fondness that exceeded what the situation seemed to warrant. They grinned and made faces at each other. One of them sat in a corner like a monkey, apparently satisfied with this arrangement. They threw objects at imaginary targets. They stripped and waded in the water, and through all of this they were not distressed. They were not frightened. They had no awareness that anything unusual was occurring. They were just somewhere else. 11 days, after which they came back, all of them, without medical intervention, and had absolutely no memory of any of it. They could not account for the time. They knew somehow that something had happened, in the way you know you've been asleep, not from memory, but from the simple fact of finding yourself somewhere new without having walked there. Beverley notes, with the understated colonial historiography that made him so readable, that the soldiers were rendered unfit for service. This, it turns out, would become something of an understatement about Datura's interactions with institutional purposes, and we'll get to that. The plant got a name out of the incident at least. Jamestown weed, which eventually became Jimson weed, one of the most dangerous. Plants in North America is named after an accidental military catering disaster. The soldiers recovered and went home and told their story, which became the story people told about what grew in Virginia, and the plant acquired its English name and a reputation that was, relative to what it deserved, still not quite alarming enough. Because a plant that has poisoned an entire military detachment and produced 11 days of documented delirium is the kind of thing that tends to inspire caution. What it actually inspired over the next century and a half was medicine. This is partly because the West had been using related plants for centuries without fully understanding the relationship between them. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, had been in European medical use since antiquity. Eye drops made from it dilated pupils for examination. The extract was used as a sedative, as an antispasmodic, as a treatment for a range of complaints with limited success and significant risk. The name itself, belladonna, beautiful woman, came from the Italian fashion of dripping it into the eyes to make the pupils large, which was considered attractive, and which also impaired vision, which was presumably considered a secondary concern. The chemistry underlying belladonna and datura was the same. The alkaloids were the same family. No one in the 18th century knew this because the systematic identification of alkaloids wouldn't come until the 19th. What they knew was that certain plants did certain things. Datura did things. The leaves, smoked, appeared to relieve asthma. This is one of those historical medical facts that reads, from a modern vantage point, as complete madness. You smoked a toxic plant to improve your breathing, and is simultaneously entirely chemically rational. The anticholinergic compounds in datura are bronchodilators. They relax the smooth muscle of the airways. The mechanism is real. The treatment worked. Datura cigarettes and datura-based smoking preparations were sold commercially across the 19th and into the early 20th century, labelled as asthma remedies, available in pharmacies, recommended by physicians. If you had asthma in 1880 and someone told you to smoke these particular cigarettes, the smoke would have been genuinely helpful, the alkaloids would have genuinely opened your airways, and the dose would have been, in most cases and with most batches, not enough to produce the full delirium. Probably. The dose problem was not being discussed with any great clarity. Then the chemists arrived. The 19th century was when organic chemistry started to become something that could actually isolate compounds from plants, instead of just pressing the plant into a cake and hoping for the best. And one of the things that happened, as chemists began systematically identifying what was in what, was that the alkaloids responsible for datura's effects were identified, named, and extracted. Atropine was isolated from belladonna in 1833 by two German pharmacists working independently. It was named for Atropos, one of the three fates, the one who cut the thread of life, which is either an appropriate name for a compound with lethal potential at the wrong dose, or evidence that 19th century German pharmacists had a strong sense of the dramatic. Probably both. Scopolamine was isolated in 1881 by a German pharmacologist named Ernst Schmidt. Scopolamine, also called hyoscine, is structurally related to atropine, targets the same receptors, and produces the same general anticholinergic effects: dry mouth, dilated pupils, elevated heart rate, and, in sufficient quantity, the seamless delirium that had been sending humans into alternate realities for 3,000 years. What scopolamine does uniquely, and what atropine does not, is produce amnesia. Profound, specific, reliable amnesia. A person given scopolamine will often have no memory of the period during which they were under its effects. The events happened. The person was present. The brain processed sensory input, generated responses, carried on what appeared to be normal activity, and then nothing. The recording never ran. Schmidt documented this. Medical literature noted it. And for a while, the amnesia was considered a side effect, an unfortunate consequence of an otherwise useful compound, something to work around. Then someone looked at it differently. The idea that would launch one of the 20th century's stranger chapters arrived in a small clinic in Freiburg, Germany, sometime around 1906. Two physicians, Karl Gauss and Bernhard Kronig, had been experimenting with combinations of scopolamine and morphine for use in childbirth. Their goal was what it always was in medicine: reduce the suffering. Labour was painful. This was known. It had been known since the beginning of recorded human experience and had produced an essentially unbroken thread of human complaint on the subject. The options available at the turn of the century were limited, imperfect, and carried their own significant risks. Chloroform was used. Ether was used. Both required careful administration and had a tendency to kill the patient at the wrong dose, which somewhat undermined the therapeutic goal. Scopolamine morphine was different. What Gauss and Kronig observed was that the combination produced what they called Dämmerschlaf, twilight sleep. The patient did not lose consciousness the way chloroform produced unconsciousness. She remained awake, responsive, physically functional. She breathed normally. Her body continued to labour. She just didn't remember it. The scopolamine handled the amnesia. The morphine handled to some degree the pain. The result was a woman who went through labour and emerged on the other side with no coherent memory of the experience. They published their results. The medical community received this with a mixture of interest and scepticism that generally characterises the medical community receiving anything, and for a few years it remained a clinical curiosity, used occasionally in specialised settings, generating modest discussion. And then the women found out about it. The twilight sleep movement is one of the more fascinating episodes in the intersection of feminism and pharmacology, and the intersection is stranger than it might initially appear. The argument as it developed in the early 1910s went roughly like this. Women suffered enormously during childbirth. This suffering was not inevitable. There existed a medical technique that could cause them to undergo the experience and remember nothing. Wealthy European women had access to this technique. American women largely did not. This was unjust. The campaign that followed was organised, articulate, and politically sophisticated in ways that reflected the broader women's suffrage movement of the same period. Articles were published. A particularly influential pair ran in McClure's magazine in 1914, describing twilight sleep in terms that were both medically detailed and personally testimonial. Women who had given birth under the procedure described their experience. They woke up, a baby was there, they had no idea when it had arrived, and they felt fine. This was the pitch, and it worked. Demand for the procedure in the United States became, by the standards of medical procedures, extraordinary. Hospitals were flooded with requests. Physicians who offered it were overwhelmed. Physicians who didn't were pressured to start. What the articles had not described, what the testimonial format made it easy to omit, was what the wards looked like from the outside. The nurses knew. The nurses had been watching the ward since the beginning, and what they watched was not the calm, dignified, mercifully oblivious experience that the magazine articles described. What they watched was scopolamine's actual mechanism, unmediated by the distance of retrospect. Women under twilight sleep were in full labour. The pain was there. The body was responding to it exactly as the body responds to pain, with resistance, movement, sound. The scopolamine prevented the memory formation. It did not prevent the experience, so the women screamed. They thrashed. They needed to be restrained in some cases, padded and secured against the sides of the bed, because the disorientation combined with the pain produced a state of active, frightened, delirious distress that the women themselves would not recall, but that everyone else in the room would. The promotional material emphasized what the patient would not remember. The promotional material did not mention what the nurses would remember for the rest of their careers. There is a particular cruelty available in a system that produces amnesia in the person for whom the amnesia is considered the product. The woman who went through a screaming, restrained, 12-hour labour under twilight sleep did not remember it. Her physician could therefore report that she had a calm, peaceful birth with no distressing recollections. The physician was accurate. The physician's account was missing roughly everything that had actually happened. Physicians documenting the procedure noted that the amnestic state did not mean the patient was comfortable, only that she would not know afterward that she had not been. The distinction between painless and forgotten pain was not in the marketing literature given particular emphasis. The nurses knew the distinction. The wards knew the distinction. The women woke up, and a baby was there, and they felt fine, and the ward had just been cleaned, and the nurses were on a different shift now, and everyone agreed that this had been a success. The movement reached its peak in the mid-1910s, produced several institutions dedicated specifically to the procedure, and then began a complicated decline. The deaths helped, in the grim way that deaths sometimes help by forcing a conversation that should have happened earlier. Several high-profile fatalities associated with twilight sleep, including the death of one of the movement's prominent American advocates, which was reported in the same publications that had championed the procedure, brought the complications into focus in a way that magazine articles had managed to avoid. The cardiovascular effects of scopolamine were not trivial. The respiratory effects were not trivial. A woman in a state of delirious, restrained, unmonitored labour was not, it turned out, in a state that guaranteed safe outcomes. The movement didn't end cleanly. Scopolamine in obstetrics persisted in various forms, in various countries, in various reduced-intensity applications through the 1960s. The full twilight sleep protocol declined. Safer anesthetics developed, epidurals arrived, and the specific use of scopolamine's amnesia as a feature, the idea that the point was for the patient not to remember, became, over time, a historical curiosity. But the amnesia property was not forgotten. Other people had ideas about it. The CIA had been paying attention to the same pharmacological literature that the obstetricians had been developing, and in the early 1950s they arrived at what seemed, within the logic of the Cold War, like a reasonable question. If scopolamine prevents memory formation, and if a person under scopolamine continues to speak and respond and engage with the people around them without appearing to notice that anything is wrong, could you use that? Could you put someone in a state where they had no memory of what they were saying, no way to organize their thoughts around a strategy of concealment, no access to the normal cognitive architecture of deliberate lying, and simply ask them questions? The answer they were looking for was yes. The answer they got was considerably more complicated. Project Artichoke and the later MKUltra programs investigated scopolamine as a potential truth serum as part of a larger effort to find reliable methods of extracting information from unwilling subjects. The Cold War had created a specific anxiety in the intelligence community that captured American operatives might be subjected to pharmacological interrogation, and that the United States should understand what was possible in that space. The scopolamine experiments were not successful in the way their architects hoped. What scopolamine produced in practice was not a subject who told the truth because they couldn't lie. It produced a subject who confabulated freely and enthusiastically, generating detailed, confident, entirely invented accounts of anything they were asked about. The same mechanism that caused the labouring women to behave as if they were in one world, while actually in another caused the interrogation subjects to generate information that felt real to them and was, in most accessible cases, not. A person under sufficient scopolamine will tell you, with complete sincerity, anything. The commitment to the account is total. The account itself is whatever the brain decided to fabricate. This was not, it turned out, useful for intelligence gathering. A machine that produced sincere confessions to things that didn't happen was, in the context of actual interrogation needs, worse than no machine at all. A false confession delivered with total conviction by a subject who genuinely could not tell it was false created work rather than resolving it. The CIA moved on to other methods, none of which are particularly cheerful to enumerate, and scopolamine's career as a truth serum was quietly filed under interesting idea, wrong execution, in the classified archives of mid-century American institutional overconfidence. Outside the archive, the same alkaloid was continuing its career through the rest of the century and the context it had originally been designed for: medicine. Scopolamine patches, worn behind the ear, became a standard treatment for motion sickness. The transdermal delivery was slower, more controlled, and produced none of the delirium. The dose was calibrated for antiemetic effect, not for blocking memory formation. The transderm Scott patch became unremarkable. Your grandmother might have one for the ferry. Your neighbour used them on flights. The alkaloid that had been Shiva's offering, a witch's ointment, a war criminal's tool and a Cold War experiment was, by the end of the 20th century, mostly in a beige patch stuck to the neck of a mildly nauseous tourist on a cruise ship. This is one of pharmacology's more complete character arcs. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Colombia, the criminal uses of the same compound had not stopped developing at all. In South America, and particularly in Colombia, where the related plant Brugmansia grows in abundance and the alkaloids are locally known as brundanga, scopolamine had maintained its oldest reputation. The criminal application is documented, not mythologized. Documented in police reports, in hospital records, in the accounts of victims who arrived at hospitals or police stations with pupils enormous and memories empty and no clear account of the preceding hours. The method was simple and effective and consistent with everything known about the compound for the previous 3,000 years. It was added to drinks. It was mixed into food. A small amount, difficult to taste, effectively odourless, dissolving without trace. And the target became cooperative, amnesiac, compliant in ways that made robbery or assault significantly easier to execute. Victims woke up in hotel rooms, in streets, in their own apartments, with no coherent memory of how they had arrived. Missing possessions, missing time. In worse cases, other things missing too. The memory gap was total, enough that police reports often read, in the relevant section, as nearly empty. Victim cannot account for the period between 9 p.m. and approximately 6 a.m. Victim has no recollection of the events described by witnesses. Victim was found at this location by the following people, none of whom the victim recognizes. There is never a reliable witness. There is always never a reliable witness. In 2012, a Vice documentary called Colombia's Most Dangerous Drug brought brundanga to international attention with a level of dramatic framing that somewhat exceeded the documented pharmacology. Claims circulated: the powder blown in the face, the instant incapacitation, the 15 seconds to helplessness. Some of this was exaggerated, some of it was not. The criminal use itself was real. The specific mechanism in some accounts was dramatized beyond what scopolamine's pharmacology could support. The mythology around the drug grew larger than the drug itself. This also was consistent with Datura's history. The plant has always attracted larger stories than could be verified. It also has a way of making the verification impossible. By the end of the 20th century, Datura had accumulated a curriculum vitae that would have required several careers to replicate. Sacred gift, murder weapon, asthma remedy, colonial catastrophe, obstetric amnesia tool, Cold War interrogation failure, criminal instrument. There was one more entry it needed before the century closed. In 1968, a graduate student at UCLA named Carlos Castaneda published a book called The Teachings of Don Juan, which described his apprenticeship to a Yaqui shaman in the Sonoran Desert and his encounters with 3 plants of power, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, and datura, which his teacher Don Juan called devil's weed. The book was a phenomenon. It sold millions of copies. It became a foundational text of 1970s countercultural spirituality. It was taken seriously by anthropologists who would later revise that judgment substantially, and it shaped how a generation of Western seekers thought about plant medicine and shamanic experience. Don Juan's description of Datura was not inviting in the way that Peyote's description was inviting. He told Castaneda, plainly, that the weed was a power and not a protector, that it gave extraordinary abilities and demanded extraordinary costs, that it was, in his framework, genuinely dangerous in a way that distinguished it from the other plants. The weed is for those who want to achieve something fast, Don Juan tells Castaneda. The weed is not for those who want to know. This is, pharmacologically speaking, accurate. Subsequent scholarship raised serious questions about whether Castaneda's accounts were ethnographically real or largely fabricated. The academic consensus tilted, eventually and fairly decisively toward fabricated, but the cultural effect was real, regardless of the source material's reliability, which is itself, now that you notice it, a very Datura kind of situation. The story was convincing enough that people believed it. The belief changed how they approached the plant. The actual plant did not care whether the story was true, and now the internet existed. And the internet had found the plant, and across forums and message boards and the drug experience sharing sites that emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s, a new generation was discovering what every generation before them had discovered, in their own context, with their own frameworks, in their own languages, with their own complete and unshakable certainty. The plant was out there. It was free. It was legal in most jurisdictions. It grew in the ditch by the road, in vacant lots, along the margins of fields and highways and the back edges of suburban gardens. You could find it in most parts of the inhabited world without particular difficulty, and it had never once, in 3,000 years of human contact, been safe. The question was whether anyone was going to read the warnings. The answer, as it always is with Datura, is that some of them did, and some of them were absolutely certain those warnings applied to someone else. And some of them were about to find out exactly what the Jamestown soldiers had found out, and the medieval witches had found out, and the labouring women had found out, and the CIA subjects had found out. That the most dangerous thing about this plant is not what it does to you. It's that while it's doing it, you have no idea. The internet, for all of its many qualities, is not very good at communicating the specific sensation of 3 days gone. You can describe it. People have described it in considerable detail in the first-person accounts that began accumulating on drug experience sharing sites in the late 1990s and accelerated through the 2000s. Erowid, the site that catalogued the subjective experience of essentially every psychoactive substance a human being could plausibly encounter, has a Datura section. It is one of the most read sections on the site, not because the experiences are good, because the experiences are strange, because reading them, even from the outside, even knowing they ended in most cases without permanent damage, produces in the reader a specific uneasy sensation, the sensation of looking at a place you could go, and never being able to determine from the description exactly where it was. The Datura section on Erowid is unusual in another respect. Most drug experience sections on harm reduction sites contain a range of reports. Good, bad, neutral, mystical, terrifying, deeply regretted. The Datura section contains, by overwhelming proportion, reports that end with some version of, "I will never do this again." Not out of disappointment, not because the experience wasn't intense, but because the experience was, in almost every case, precisely as advertised, a complete replacement of reality, an absolute amnesia, and a recovery that felt less like waking up than like being handed a police report about yourself and being asked to sign it. The accounts are not short. People who survive Datura delirium tend to write extensively about the experience they cannot remember. This is one of its consistent ironies. The absence creates a compulsion to document, to fill in from outside what the inside could not record. The reports reconstruct as completely as available witnesses allow what happened during the gap, and then they Describe, in the part they do have access to, the strange texture of recovering, the confusion that lingers after the delirium clears, the day or two when reality has a slightly provisional quality, as if it hasn't quite committed to being reliable again. The specific, persistent uncertainty about whether you're fully back, which, given that the delirium felt indistinguishable from reality, is not a question you can answer with full confidence. Here is what the internet says, aggregated across hundreds of accounts. You plan carefully. This is almost universal. The person who takes Datura recreationally in the modern era is not, in most cases, a person who didn't know about the warnings. They've read the warnings, they've read the trip reports. They understand that this plant is not like other substances, and that its effects are, in the polite terminology of harm reduction communities, unpredictable and potentially severe. They plan a careful dose. They measure what they have, or estimate what they have, or proceed with what they have based on a comparison to accounts they've read from people who appear to have survived similar amounts. They take it at home usually, somewhere controlled, often with a friend present, someone sober, someone who can intervene if anything goes wrong. This is the plan. The plan will not survive contact with the plant. The first sign in most accounts is not the delirium, it's the physical effects. Dry mouth arrives fast. A parching, absolute dryness that makes swallowing feel like it requires planning. The pupils begin to dilate. The skin gets hot. A flushed, slightly unreal warmth that is not quite fever and not quite fever's opposite. The heart rate climbs. These are the body's signals that something has changed. They are the anticholinergic toxidrome arriving in its opening act. Then the visual disturbances start, but not the kind that announce themselves as disturbances. Not the walls breathing, not the colours, shifting, not the clearly extraordinary geometry of an LSD experience in which the wrongness of the world is unmistakable. What comes with Datura is different. People appear, or disappear, or the room changes in ways that are so consistent with the normal range of room change that there is nothing to flag. The light is slightly different. There is an object on the counter that may have been there before or may not have been. A person you know is in the doorway. You don't know if they are in the doorway. You think they are in the doorway. The transition into full delirium is, in most accounts, not a transition. There is no moment where the person says, something has changed. There is no seam. 1 minute the person is sitting somewhere, probably at home, probably in a state they would describe as feeling a little odd, and then an indeterminate amount of time later they are somewhere else, doing something, fully convinced of the reality of what they're doing. The accounts always have to be reconstructed from external sources. The sober friend who was supposed to be monitoring describes what happened. A roommate noticed. A family member came home. Someone got a text message that made no sense and came to check. What they found, in most accounts, was a person who appeared to be entirely engaged in ordinary life, having conversations, performing tasks, moving through the space with purpose, in a world that wasn't there. The cigarette hallucination is so common, it has become the identifying feature. Not metaphorically, literally. The phantom cigarette has appeared in Datura accounts from so many different people, across so many different contexts that it has become the cultural marker. The way a certain kind of trip report reader will recognise the substance without being told. A person in Datura delirium smokes cigarettes that don't exist. They reach for the pack. They find it. They extract a cigarette with the specific practiced ease of a person who has done this 10,000 times. They light it. The lighter flickers exactly right, or maybe a match, or maybe a friend's lighter which is borrowed and handed back with a nod. They inhale. The first exhale has its particular satisfaction. They continue talking to whoever they're talking to, relaxed in the particular way that a cigarette after tension can produce. The cigarette is not there. The pack is not there. The lighter is not there. If there is a sober observer, the sober observer watches someone perform the entire physical sequence, the reach, the extraction, the lighting, the draw, the exhale, against empty air, with no apparent awareness that the props are missing. The sober observer does not know what to say. The person in the delirium does not know there is anything to say. When the experience ends, hours or days later, the person with the Datura does not remember the cigarettes. The person who watched them smoke cigarettes that weren't there does remember and will remember for some time, possibly forever. The people who appear are harder to describe and more significant. The most commonly reported figures are people the user knows, friends, family, partners, people whose faces and voices the brain has rendered many thousands of times and can therefore reproduce with high fidelity. These people appear in the delirious environment and participate in it. They have conversations, they make observations, they laugh at things, they hand the user objects. What distinguishes these from a classic hallucination in the accounts that describe them is not vividness, it's that they're mundane. The friend who appears does not appear to deliver prophecy or revelation. The friend appears to hang out, to talk about something that was on television, to ask whether you want coffee. The conversation is the kind of conversation that would be unremarkable between these two people on any normal day. The brain, in generating this experience, is not reaching for the extreme. It is reaching for the familiar. It is filling in the blanks of Tuesday with whatever is most usual. This is the mechanism. The acetylcholine receptors responsible for connecting sensory input with conscious attention are offline. The sensory input is coming in, the attention is operating, but the connection between them is severed, and in the gap, the brain generates plausible content, not random, not alien, but specifically calibrated to resemble the ordinary world with enough fidelity that nothing triggers the alarm. The alarm isn't there to trigger. The compound that would activate it is being blocked. Some accounts describe a particular terror that arrives afterward, not during. During there is no terror. During is fine. During is Tuesday, slightly warm, slightly dry in the mouth, but Tuesday. After, when the person comes back far enough to receive the information about what actually happened during the preceding period, the accounting can be distressing in proportion to its gaps. You did what? You were where? That was 3 days ago. This is a specific category of horror that is difficult to access from the outside. The horror of the gap. Not the horror of a bad experience, which is at least an experience you can reference and process and place in your history. The horror of an absence, of time that is simply not there, of a self that apparently continued to function, to speak, to move, to engage with the world in your body and left no account. Most people who go through this once do not seek the experience again. This is the logical response. The counterintuitive fact, documented with some regularity in the same forums where the warnings are posted, is that the lack of memory can itself become a factor in repeat exposure. The deterrent that a bad drug experience normally provides, the memory, the morning after, the weeks of recovery, is structurally absent. You can know intellectually that the experience was bad. You have been told it was bad, but you cannot remember it being bad in the way that makes badness self-deterring. You cannot teach someone a lesson they weren't there for. The drug community's response to Datura is unusual in the harm reduction space. Most drugs have their advocates. Even drugs with serious harm profiles tend to attract people who argue, on some combination of personal liberty grounds and experiential testimony, that the risks are overstated, that with proper preparation and setting and mindset the experience can be valuable, that the horror stories come from people who weren't careful. Datura doesn't get this. The consistent position in harm reduction communities, from Erowid, from Reddit forums, from psychedelic communities that are generally enthusiastic about a wide range of substances, is don't. Not be careful. Not with proper preparation. Not for experienced users only. Just don't. The drug that has been receiving the most universal condemnation from the community most invested in finding positive frameworks for drug use is the drug that takes away your ability to form a memory of how bad it was. This is either ironic or completely logical, depending on how you hold it. The warnings are posted consistently. They are read consistently. And consistently, new people decide they are the exception. The Erowid reports are instructive in a particular way. Many of them begin with variations on the same sentence. I had read the warnings. I knew what I was getting into. I understood this was different from other psychedelics. The narrator positions themselves at the start as someone who has done the research, approached this responsibly, taken precautions, and then the account proceeds and the careful preparation dissolves into the familiar sequence, physical effects, the start of something, the gap, the reconstruction. The reports are often written with a quality of genuine surprise. Not at the drug exactly. They knew the drug was supposed to do this, but at the specificity of finding themselves inside the general description, at the particular texture of a Tuesday that wasn't Tuesday, at the cigarettes. Nearly everyone mentions the cigarettes. One report describes a person reaching for the same phantom cigarette approximately 40 times over the course of an hour in the presence of a friend who was counting. Each time the reach was fresh. Each time the extraction was confident. Each time the lighting and smoking were performed with complete and apparently satisfied conviction. The friend was not sure what to write down in the notes they'd been asked to keep. Smoked 40 cigarettes seemed both accurate and inaccurate in ways that resisted resolution. What makes Datura specifically unlike every other drug in the documented human pharmacopoeia is not the danger. Other drugs are more dangerous in measurable terms. The margin between an active dose and a lethal dose is narrow in ways that don't apply to many other things. But there are substances with narrower margins. What makes it singular is the epistemological problem. The drug removes the capacity to know you are affected, not as a side effect, not as an occasional outcome, as its fundamental mechanism. The compounds that block acetylcholine receptors are doing at the molecular level exactly what the experience reports describe at the phenomenological level. They are disconnecting the part of your brain that integrates what's happening from the part that says, this is what's happening. The witness, if there is a witness, is not you. You're not in a position to witness. And the body, meanwhile, is doing things that have nothing to do with whether you know about them. The heart rate is elevated, the temperature is rising. In significant doses, the cardiovascular strain is not trivial. There are people who have died of Datura poisoning in states of complete, contented delirium, in the middle of what felt from the inside like an entirely normal Tuesday. The body doesn't get the memo about Tuesday. The body is managing a genuine anticholinergic crisis regardless of whether the mind has been informed. This is why the most serious Datura poisonings are sometimes the hardest to identify. A person in profound delirium, apparently calm, apparently engaged in ordinary activity, is not presenting as a medical emergency from the outside in the way that, say, convulsions present. They may look eccentric. They may look unwell in a vague way. They may look like someone who had a long night. The pupils tell the story. They are always enormous, dark and wide and unresponsive to light in a way that, if you know what you're looking at, reads immediately as anticholinergic toxidrome. But most people do not know what they're looking at, and the person in the delirium is not going to tell you. They are having a cigarette. Children encounter the plant accidentally at a rate that produces regular cases in hospital emergency departments, in regions where Datura grows wild. The plant's flowers are fragrant and the seeds in their pods are accessible and without obvious visual warning. Children eat flowers. Children eat seeds. Children do not have prior experience with the concept of poisonous plants that look like ornamental flowers. The resulting pediatric anticholinergic cases follow the same pattern as adult recreational exposures, with the significant difference that no one chose them. A child who consumed Datura seeds in a garden is in an identical physiological state to a soldier who boiled the shoots as a vegetable in 1676. The mechanism does not distinguish. Agricultural workers handling the plant in regions where it grows prolifically have been poisoned through skin absorption. Foragers who mistook young Datura shoots for edible plants have landed in hospitals. The plant grows in agricultural fields alongside edible crops, and the young shoots, before the distinctive leaf shape fully develops, can resemble greens. The plant has always been better at spreading than humans have been at identifying it. The experience cannot be reported from the inside. The inside doesn't know it has anything to report. There is a detail in the historical record worth sitting with. In most of the documented traditional, ceremonial uses of Datura, the Chumash Momoy ritual, the Aztec Toloash ceremonies, the Hindu context where Datura is acknowledged as dangerous, the person going into the experience was accompanied, watched, monitored by someone whose entire role was to remain outside the experience and maintain awareness of the person inside it. Not to intervene necessarily, not to stop the experience, but to be there, to be the witness that the person inside could not be for themselves. This was not incidental, it was structural. The ceremony, in its traditional form, built in the external observer as a required component. The person going into the Datura state was not considered to be undergoing a solo experience. They were considered to be undergoing an experience that required two people, the one inside and the one watching. The shaman or specialist who administered the dose was not simply providing the substance. They were agreeing to hold the external record, or to be the thing that the person inside had no access to. If the person came back and asked, "What did I do? Where did I go? What happened while I was not here?" the answer existed somewhere. It was in another person's memory. This is not a spiritual accommodation. This is pharmacology. 3,000 years of observation by people who understood the plant through practice rather than chemistry had arrived at the correct clinical conclusion. A person under Datura cannot witness their own experience. Someone else has to do it. The traditional framework had built into its ceremonial structure an acknowledgement of the drug's defining feature, not despite the feature, but because of it. You couldn't know what happened to you while you were inside it. So the tradition provided someone who could. That structural provision, the companion, the keeper, the watcher, was the closest thing to a safe use protocol that history produced for this substance. The modern recreational user, at home, having read the warnings, having decided they understood the risks, often alone or with a friend who had also taken the same amount, typically did not have this. The friend who was supposed to be monitoring was, in enough accounts to constitute a pattern, also in the delirium, both of them smoking cigarettes that weren't there, neither of them knowing. The emergency room doctors have a term for what presents when a Datura poisoning comes through the door. They call it the anticholinergic toxidrome, which is a clinical way of saying, here is a person whose acetylcholine receptors have been substantially blocked, and here is the predictable constellation of effects that results from that. Pupils fully dilated, unresponsive to direct light. Skin hot and dry and flushed, as if the person has been running a fever and also a moderate distance. Heart rate elevated, significantly elevated, in serious cases running high enough to be a concern on its own. Urinary retention, the smooth muscle of the bladder affected along with everything else, and the mental status, confused, disoriented, with or without agitation, with or without the full delirium depending on dose and timing. The toxidrome has a mnemonic in medical education: hot as a hare, blind as a bat, dry as a bone, red as a beet, mad as a hatter. which is, as medical mnemonics go, fairly accurate and somewhat literary. The treatment is supportive. There is an antidote, physostigmine, which inhibits the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, temporarily restoring the balance. But it requires careful dosing and careful monitoring, and has its own risks. The standard management is to keep the patient safe, monitor the cardiac situation, manage the hypothermia, and wait. The waiting can take a while. The delirium can persist for 24 to 72 hours. The pupil dilation can persist for a week. The emergency room during this time contains a person who is entirely convinced they are somewhere else, who may be cooperative or may be agitated, who will in most cases have no memory of being there at all. The chart will note the presenting symptoms. The chart will not be readable by the person it describes. The plant, meanwhile, was not thinking about any of this. It was growing in ditches. It was blooming in the dark. Its trumpet-shaped flowers were opening after sunset the way they always had, white and improbable, and slightly wrong-smelling, producing the seeds that would catch on passing clothes and migrate further down the road. The alkaloids in its tissues were there because insects eat plants, and alkaloids that taste wrong or produce neurological effects in insects discourage that. The scopolamine was not meant for humans. The atropine was not meant for anything that had acetylcholine receptors in the relevant configuration. It was a defense mechanism against leaf eaters. It was a defense mechanism against leaf eaters that happened to produce, in humans with their specific neurological architecture, the most convincing delusion in the documented history of pharmacology. The plant didn't engineer this. The plant didn't know. The plant is, in the most complete and literal sense, not responsible. It was just photosynthesizing. We're the ones who couldn't leave it alone. And we still haven't. That's the part the 3,000 years of documentation doesn't quite prepare you for. Not the history, which is strange enough. Not the pharmacology, which is strange enough. But the current fact that somewhere right now, in a country where Datura grows wild and freely and without restriction, someone is planning a careful dose. They have read the warnings. They understand this is different from other substances. They have a friend who will stay sober and keep notes. They are absolutely certain they know what they are doing. They are the most convinced person in the room. They are about to find out what the witches found out, and the soldiers found out, and the women in the Twilight Sleep wards found out, and every forum contributor who has ever filed a report beginning "I had read the warnings" has found out. That certainty is the drug working. The drug starts before you take it. It starts in the planning. It starts in the confidence. It starts in the moment you think, "I understand this one." The plant is still there. This seems worth saying plainly at the end of 3,000 years of documentation. Most drugs that accumulate this kind of history eventually get scheduled, regulated, placed into a controlled category that acknowledges their potential for harm and attempts, with varying degrees of success, to manage access. Heroin is a Schedule 1 substance. MDMA is a Schedule 1 substance. Psilocybin mushrooms in most jurisdictions are Schedule 1 substances. Datura is a weed. It is not scheduled. It is not regulated. It does not require a prescription, a dealer, a dark web connection, or any form of criminal enterprise to obtain. It requires a walk. In most inhabited parts of the world, a moderately attentive person can find it within reasonable distance of wherever they happen to be. The alkaloids extracted from it, scopolamine in pharmaceutical form, atropine in pharmaceutical form, are prescription substances in most countries. The raw plant, which contains those alkaloids in wildly variable concentrations with no packaging, no dosage information, no childproof cap, and no phone number for poison control printed on the label, is available in the ditch by the road. This is not an oversight. It is simply that the plant predates the regulatory apparatus by several thousand years and has not been considered sufficiently tractable to schedule. You cannot make a weed illegal in any meaningful sense. You can make it illegal to possess in concentrated form, but you cannot prevent it from growing in the margins of the inhabited world, catching seeds on passing clothing, blooming at night in places that no enforcement agency has the resources to monitor. Every culture that encountered it developed a framework for it: sacred, criminal, medical, recreational, shamanic, pharmacological. The frameworks are wildly different. The plant is indifferent to all of them. It grows in the ditch by the road. It blooms at night. The flowers close before morning, and the spiked pods dry through the summer, and the seeds distribute themselves into the margins of the world with the patient efficiency of something that has no deadline and no preference about outcome. The Chumash built a ceremony around it. The Aztec built a theology around it. The medieval church built a trial record around it. Gauss and Kronig built a maternity ward around it. The CIA built a classified program around it. Columbia built a warning system around it. The internet built a forum around it. The plant didn't ask for any of this. It was just making alkaloids. Let's stay with that paradox for a moment, because it is one of the more genuinely strange things in the long history of dangerous substances. Most dangerous drugs end up regulated. This is the general pattern. A substance becomes associated with harm. Harm accumulates documentation. Documentation attracts policy attention. Policy produces scheduling. Scheduling produces enforcement. The cycle is imperfect, frequently unjust, often decades behind the actual harm it's responding to. But the cycle exists, and most substances eventually enter it. Datura is not in the cycle, not because it wasn't considered. The alkaloids it contains, scopolamine, atropine, are tightly controlled in pharmaceutical form. A scopolamine patch requires a prescription in most countries. An injectable atropine solution is a regulated medical device. The purified compounds, in controlled dosage, are managed by the same apparatus that manages every other prescription pharmaceutical. The plant that produces those compounds is a weed. This creates a situation of almost perfect regulatory incoherence. The active ingredient is scheduled, and the raw source containing the active ingredient in unpredictable concentrations with no quality control, no dosage guidance, and no poison control information is available to anyone who goes for a walk. The pharmacies sell atropine eye drops in childproof, containers with warning labels and dosage charts and a phone number to call if something goes wrong. The plant producing atropine grows in the ditch outside and has no label. No enforcement agency has the capacity to address this, because the capacity required would be the capacity to schedule the concept of a weed, which does not exist as a legal category. You can make it illegal to sell. You cannot make it illegal to grow in a ditch. The plant has been in the ditch longer than the concept of scheduling. It will be in the ditch longer than the enforcement apparatus designed to prevent people from eating it. Meanwhile, every hospital with an emergency department maintains a protocol for anticholinergic toxidrome presentation. Not because it's common, it isn't in most places a daily occurrence, but because it recurs with enough regularity across enough different circumstances, accidental, recreational, criminal, pediatric, that emergency physicians are trained to recognize it. The protocol is not complicated. Pupil dilation plus confusion plus elevated heart rate plus dry-hot skin equals find out if this person has been near a Solanese plant recently or near a scopolamine source and manage the symptoms while the alkaloids clear. The management window is long. A person admitted in full Datura delirium on a Monday may still be in the hospital on Wednesday. The pupils may still be dilated on Friday. The full return to baseline can take days, and the staff who managed the case during those days have a complete record of everything that happened to the patient. The patient has no record at all. The chart will note the presenting symptoms. It will note the interventions. It will describe in clinical language what the person was doing when they arrived, what they said, how they responded to questions about their name and the current year, at what point coherence began returning. It will be signed by the attending physician and filed. It will be readable by everyone except the person it describes. When the patient eventually reads it, and most patients do, because the human impulse to know what happened to you is not cancelled by the inability to remember, they will read it the way you read a police report about an incident you didn't witness. They will recognise none of it as memory. They will understand intellectually that it describes events in their own body. They will be unable to connect it to any felt experience, because there is no felt experience to connect it to. They were there. There is no record of being there. The chart exists. The experience does not. The alkaloids themselves are worth a moment, because they are one of the stranger accidents in the long history of chemistry that wasn't trying to be chemistry. Scopolamine and atropine and hyoscyamine exist in Datura for one reason, which is that insects eat plants, and plants that produce compounds toxic or neurologically disruptive to insects tend to survive better than plants that don't. The tropane alkaloids that have been reshaping human history since before written records began were evolved as a pest control system, a defense mechanism against caterpillars, not against shamanic seekers, not against British soldiers with poor vegetable identification skills, not against intelligence agencies with theories about interrogation, not against labouring women in German clinics, not against anyone with a set of acetylcholine receptors and a reason to test their luck. The plant did not know about acetylcholine receptors. The plant was not making a choice. The compound that blocks memory formation in humans blocks whatever it blocks in the nervous systems of the insects that would otherwise eat the leaves, and the plants survive to reproduce, and the seeds spread, and the alkaloids persist in every part of every generation, because they continue to work exactly as they were evolved to work. The effect on humans is a side effect. The most consequential side effect in the history of human spiritual experience is a side effect. Witches flew, soldiers lost 11 days, women forgot labour, intelligence agencies wasted classified budgets. Modern users became absolutely certain, with the confidence of someone who has read the warnings, that they understood what they were dealing with. The caterpillars were the point. There's a particular quality to the way Datura keeps finding new frameworks. Most substances with long histories tend to accumulate interpretation. They are understood in one way, then another, and each understanding builds on or reacts to the previous one. Opium becomes morphine, becomes heroin, becomes the opioid crisis. A through line is traceable. The people working with the substance in each era have some access to what previous eras learned, even if they choose to ignore it. Datura doesn't have this. The gaps between its frameworks are too wide, and the transmission of knowledge across those gaps is essentially zero. The culture that made Datura a sacred tool and the culture that made it an interrogation substance share nothing except the alkaloids. The Chumash specialist who administered Momoy in a California puberty rite, and the German obstetrician who administered scopolamine morphine in a Freiburg clinic were solving completely different problems with the same compound, and had no access to each other's results. There is no continuity of understanding, no accumulated wisdom that passed intact from one encounter to the next. Each framework discovered the plant fresh. Each framework was absolutely certain it understood what it was dealing with. Each framework was right about some things, and catastrophically wrong about others. The Chumash understood the danger. They did not have the phrase anticholinergic toxidrome, but they had a ceremony that acknowledged in its structure the exact clinical reality the phrase describes. The person who went in could not witness themselves. Someone had to watch. This is pharmacologically correct, and it took Western medicine until the 21st century to produce literature that stated it in those terms. The twilight sleep advocates understood the amnesia. They did not understand, or understood and chose not to foreground, what the amnesia was covering. The distinction between she will not remember the pain and the pain will not happen is not merely semantic, and the wards knew the difference even when the pamphlets did not address it. The CIA understood the suggestibility. They did not understand that the suggestibility produced fiction at the same rate as truth, and that a subject who would sincerely confess to anything was less useful than a subject who said nothing. The program ended. The lesson was filed somewhere it would not be retrieved. The modern recreational user understands, having read the warnings, that this substance is different from other substances. They do not understand, because the warnings cannot convey it, what it will feel like to be inside a difference they cannot detect. Everyone had part of the plant. Nobody had the whole plant. The whole plant doesn't fit in any one framework. The whole plant is a thing that removes the capacity to know it has been encountered, that deploys this feature against caterpillars and has been accidentally deploying it against human civilization since the first person looked at the white flowers and said, "I wonder what that is." And that person was absolutely certain they were the first person to look. They were not. They were just the latest in a line that stretches back to before anyone was writing things down, all of them looking at the same flowers, all of them equally certain, and none of them able to compare notes with the people who came before, because the people who came before were also inside the gap when it mattered. Carlos Castaneda called it devil's weed and said it was for those who want to achieve something fast. This turned out to be accurate in a way Castaneda may not have fully intended. The thing it achieves fast is the removal of the part of you that would evaluate whether achievement was happening. By the time you notice something has changed, you are already inside the change. The achievement, if that's the word, is complete before you can assess it. And then it's over, or it feels over, or you wake into what seems like over but is still inside. And the question of whether achievement occurred is not a question you can answer because you were not there when it was happening. Castaneda's accounts, whatever their factual reliability, captured something real about the plant's character. It is not a companion. It does not accompany. It does not walk beside you through an altered landscape while leaving you some thread back to ordinary reality. It substitutes. It takes what was there and replaces it, and the replacement runs on the same substrate with the same confidence, and you cannot tell from inside the replacement that a replacement occurred. Don Juan, Castaneda's teacher, whose historical existence is disputed but whose pharmacological instincts were, in this specific case, sound, drew a careful line between Datura and the other plants of his tradition. Mescalito was a protector, a guide, something that could be encountered and learned from and brought back to ordinary life enriched by what the encounter revealed. The weed was a power, not a teacher, not a guide. A power in the sense that a storm is a power, something that operates at a scale beyond the human and is not organized around the human's benefit or instruction. The distinction maps precisely onto the pharmacological difference. Peyote, mescaline, psilocybin. These compounds act on serotonin receptors and produce experiences that are strange, sometimes terrifying, sometimes beautiful, and throughout which some part of the person taking them remains present as an observer. The strangeness is visible as strangeness. The altered state announces itself. You can be afraid of what you're seeing because you know you're seeing something extraordinary. Datura removes the observer. The part of you that would say, "This is extraordinary," is offline. The part of you that would be afraid is offline. What remains is a person moving through a fabricated world with the complete ease of someone in the ordinary one, which is precisely what makes it look from the outside so uncanny. The counterculture that encountered Castaneda's books in the 1970s was broadly interested in plant medicines as paths to insight, peyote, mushrooms, ayahuasca. The framework was, difficult experience produces difficult but productive revelation. You go in, something breaks open, you come back changed and knowing something new. Datura does not do that. Datura produces a 3-day absence, and then a conversation with the people who watched you from outside. Whatever insight might be available is in their account, not yours. Their account describes someone who appeared to be functioning normally, while doing things that made no sense. There is no revelation in that account because the person who went through the experience was not processing it as experience. They were living inside a fabricated Tuesday, completely confident, and the fabricated Tuesday produced no wisdom because it was not real and did not know it was not real. The insight, if there is one, is entirely retrospective and entirely second-hand, which is, now that you notice it, a reasonable description of most of what we know about Datura's history. All of it reconstructed, all of it from the outside, all of it describing something the primary subject cannot corroborate. The whole plant is, in the end, this, a thing that removes the capacity to know it has been encountered. This is the sentence that all the frameworks converge on, from the Inquisition records to the emergency room charts to the forum posts. Every documentation of Datura, every culture's accumulated record of what this plant does to people, is a record assembled from the outside by people who were watching someone else go through something that the person going through it could not describe. The Inquisitors were outside. Beverly was outside. The nurses in the twilight sleep wards were outside. The sober friend keeping notes was outside. The trip report writer, when they returned, was reconstructing from outside sources what happened to their inside. The person in the hospital being asked by a physician to describe what they took and when, they were functionally also outside, providing testimony about an event they did not attend. This is consistent across every context and every century. The documentation of Datura is always second-hand. The primary source is always unavailable. The person who was there cannot speak to what it was like to be there, because the mechanism that would allow them to speak to it is the mechanism that was taken offline. The Inquisitors got signed confessions. The confessions described Sabbaths in detail. The accused believed everything they signed. None of it was experience in the sense that experience normally works, a felt event, retained and reconstructible. It was a delirious performance, witnessed by observers who were not inside it, signed by someone who had no access to the original, used as evidence of crimes that were chemically produced. Beverly's soldiers came back from 11 days and could give no account. The women who went through twilight sleep woke up and described it as painless. What they described was the absence of memory, not the absence of pain. Both things were true. Neither was what the staff on the other side of the room had witnessed. Every documentation is from the outside. The inside is always gone. It happened. It is not. It available. What does get accessed eventually is the question. Everyone who survives a significant Datura experience and returns to something resembling coherence tends to arrive, at some point, at the same question. Not, what did I see, or what did I feel, but what was I doing for 3 days? The question is unanswerable from the inside. The answer assembled from whatever external sources are available. The neighbour's account, the messages sent, the shoes by the door, the friend who was watching and keeping notes, the friend who was also gone and had no notes, the hospital chart, is always partial. A reconstruction, a document with large sections redacted by chemistry rather than classification. The gap is permanent. The events are gone, not suppressed. Gone, not encoded in the first place. The system that normally runs the recording was occupied with other things, or more precisely, the recording mechanism requires acetylcholine functioning to run, and the acetylcholine was being blocked, and so the recording never started. What happened during those hours, whatever was felt, wherever the person went, whatever the person did, whoever they spoke to in whatever rendering their brain produced of the people they knew, is not accessible, not recoverable with the right technique, not reachable with hypnosis or therapy or any external intervention. The events are in the gap, and the gap is sealed. This is different from forgetting. Forgetting is when a memory exists but becomes inaccessible over time. You can sometimes reach a forgotten memory. You can sometimes be reminded. The trace is there, faded, possibly retrievable. Datura doesn't produce faded traces. It produces no trace at all. The gap is the same gap that swallowed the Jamestown soldiers 11 days. The same gap that swallowed whatever the accused witches genuinely experienced in the nights before they signed their confessions. The same gap that swallowed the labouring, women's hours in the twilight sleep wards, and which was sold to them as the product. The same gap that made the CIA's subjects willing to confess to anything, because there was no stored sense of self to protect, no memory of previous statements to stay consistent with, nothing but the fabricated present and whoever was asking questions. Every generation finds the gap. Every generation falls into it. The gap is not a warning. The gap is the feature. The plant built the gap to keep caterpillars from eating its leaves, and the gap has been swallowing human experience ever since, and the plant has not noticed, because it is a plant. The person who was there, doing things, moving through space, smoking cigarettes and talking to absent friends and living inside a fully rendered version of Tuesday, that person left no record of what it was like to be them. That person was you, but you weren't there for it. You were somewhere the pharmacology can't follow, and the person who was in your body during that time, who spoke in your voice and moved with your hands and reached with your fingers for the cigarette that wasn't there, that person's experience dissolved with the delirium and left nothing behind. This is the complete account. This is all there is. And yet, the plant is still growing. And somewhere, right now, the question is forming in someone's mind. The same question that has formed in every generation that has ever found these flowers blooming after dark. Not is this safe? That question somehow never quite arrives first. The question is always, I wonder what that is. This is, if you sit with it long enough, a fairly unsettling observation about the nature of experience in general. Not a comfortable one, not a useful one necessarily, but an honest one. The brain generates a continuous report of what's happening. This report feels immediate. It feels accurate. It feels like the world arriving in real time, translated faithfully by the sensory systems and processed by the cognitive ones, and delivered to consciousness as an ongoing, trustworthy account of Tuesday. This is not quite what's happening. What's happening is that the brain takes fragmentary, incomplete sensory information, light hitting the retina, pressure against the skin, vibrations in the air, and constructs, from that, a model. The model is usually very good. The model is the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary pressure toward accuracy, and it tends to be accurate enough to navigate by, accurate enough to catch the ball and cross the street and recognize the face of someone you love. But it is a model. The model is not the world. The model is the brain's best current interpretation of the available signals, filtered through expectation and memory and the specific architecture of a nervous system that was optimized for certain kinds of problems in certain kinds of environments, and has been doing its best in all subsequent environments since. Most of the time, this is fine. The model and the world are close enough that the gap between them is not relevant to anything you're trying to do. Datura is the case where the gap becomes everything. Most of the time, you trust the witness. You trust that the version of events your brain produces is, in its broad outlines, a reasonable account of what's happening. The walls do not usually breathe. The people in the room are usually there. The cigarette you're smoking is usually a cigarette. You have no mechanism outside of the ordinary functioning of the system to verify this. The system tells you it's functioning. You have only the system's word. This is not normally a problem. The system is well calibrated. The vast majority of the time, Tuesday is Tuesday, and the person in the doorway is in the doorway, and the report your brain generates about the current state of the world is accurate enough to navigate by. The system runs, generation after generation, with a reliability that is one of the more impressive achievements in the history of biology. Datura is notable specifically because it reveals that the word is revocable, that the confident report of everything is normal, Tuesday is Tuesday, Marcus is here, the cigarette is real, is produced by a mechanism that can be entirely replaced while continuing to feel entirely reliable, not distorted, replaced. The person under LSD knows something is different. They can feel the gap between the drug's report and the system's usual output. The strangeness is perceptible because the normal report is still running underneath or alongside, and the contrast is available. You can be frightened by what you're seeing because you know you're seeing something extraordinary. The person under Datura has no normal report running. There is only the fabricated one, and it is indistinguishable from the real one, not because the fabrication is so good, but because the part of the system that would notice a difference has been taken offline. This does not mean that your Tuesday is in doubt. It means that the thing generating the report about Tuesday is a piece of biological hardware that has, across 3,000 years of documented human history, been demonstrably replaceable without detection. You never question it. That's the feature, not the bug. That's what makes you a functional human being in the ordinary world. The deep, unexamined confidence that what you're perceiving is what's there. Datura is the thing that makes you notice you had that confidence by temporarily, and in most cases survivably, removing it, without telling you. Most people afterward find this unsettling in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely. Not traumatic necessarily, not permanently damaging in every case, but unsettling in the specific way that finding out a foundational assumption was contingent is unsettling. You thought the floor was solid. The floor is solid. But now you've seen the gap underneath it, and you know it wasn't always solid for those 3 days, and the floor is solid again, and you trust it again. But you know something about it now that you didn't know before. The gap is still there. The floor is just closed over it again. The people in this story who ended up in the gap without intending to end up there, the soldiers, the labouring women, the victims in Bogota, the children who ate flowers because flowers are beautiful, and nothing in childhood experience suggests that beautiful things are the ones you must not eat. Those people have a different relationship to the gap than the people who went looking for it. They didn't find a drug. They found a gap. The gap was there when they arrived, and it was there when they left, and the time between arrival and departure is simply absent from their account of their own lives. There is a clinical word for this kind of amnesia, anterograde, meaning the inability to form new memories going forward from a specific point, as opposed to retrograde, which affects memories that already existed before an event. Datura produces a form of anterograde amnesia during its active period. New memories cannot form. The events of Tuesday are not encoded. Tuesday exists in the external record and not in the internal one. People with certain types of brain injury live permanently in this state. The hippocampus, the brain structure most critical for encoding new memories, stops functioning, and they remain, effectively, at the moment of their injury. They can recall everything before the injury with precision. They cannot learn that time has passed since. Datura does this temporarily, deliberately from the plant's perspective, not at all. The plant doesn't have a perspective, but the effect is the same. A person who is present, functional, apparently engaged with the world, who was not laying down any record of being so. Beverly's soldiers came back from 11 days with no account. They spent the rest of their lives, presumably, as people who had a gap of 11 days in their personal history that could not be recovered. Something happened. The external record said, you blew feathers, you kissed your companions, you stripped and waded in water, you were unfit for service. The internal record said, nothing. The gap was in them permanently, even after the alkaloids cleared. The alkaloids cleared. The gap did not. There is a peculiar comfort in the end, in the plant's indifference. This sounds counterintuitive. An indifferent force is not usually comforting. But there is something about Datura's specific indifference. The fact that none of this was aimed at humans, none of it was designed for human use, none of it carries any intent toward the humans who have been engaging with it for 3,000 years. That is, on reflection, clarifying. The witches didn't make a pact with the devil. They applied a compound to their skin, and their acetylcholine receptors responded to it the same way acetylcholine receptors respond to that compound in every organism that has them. The experience was real. The Sabbath was pharmacology. The confession was a description of anticholinergic delirium delivered in good faith by someone who had no framework for understanding what they had experienced. The inquisitors, receiving the confession, also had no framework. The framework available to them was theological. The theological framework was wrong, but it was the only one present, and it processed the pharmacological event as a supernatural one, and wrote it down as evidence, and the written evidence was used to produce outcomes that are among the less defensible episodes in European institutional history. None of it required malice. All of it required the absence of the right framework. The soldiers didn't encounter some supernatural force of American wilderness. They encountered scopolamine and atropine in concentration sufficient to produce the full anticholinergic syndrome, and their nervous systems responded exactly as nervous systems respond to that, and they spent 11 days in a state that Beverly recorded with the deadpan precision of a man who could not quite believe what he was writing, but understood that writing it precisely was the right response. The women in the twilight sleep wards weren't experiencing a painless miracle. They were experiencing a pharmacologically induced absence of memory encoding, and their bodies were doing the ordinary painful biological work of labour underneath it, and the two things were happening simultaneously in the same person with no communication between them, and the promotional literature described the absence of memory as the absence of pain, because the literature was written by people who could not distinguish between those two things, and the women reading the literature also could not distinguish between them, because neither group had a framework for anticholinergic amnesia. The CIA subjects weren't revealing deep truth. They were confabulating, which is what brains do when the normal integrating mechanisms are offline, and the question-answering system keeps running regardless. The confabulation was sincere. It was produced by a brain doing its best under extraordinary conditions. It was entirely useless as intelligence, and entirely comprehensible as pharmacology. None of it was personal, all of it was chemistry. The plant was photosynthesizing. We're the ones who kept showing up and constructing meaning around the photosynthesis. The meaning we constructed was in most cases wrong, about the mechanism and right about the experience. The witches genuinely flew in the phenomenological sense. They had an experience of flying that was as complete and convincing as any experience of flight could be, and they reported it faithfully. The experience was real. The mechanism was alkaloids and not supernatural agency. The distinction between these two things was not available to the people involved. The Chumash boy who went into the Momoy ceremony genuinely met something. Whatever the brain generates in the specific state produced by a controlled Datura administration, guided by a specialist who has seen this many times before and knows how to hold the container, that's a real experience of something. It's not a supernatural experience. It's a very specific neurological state that the Chumash had learned, over generations of careful observation, how to produce and how to hold. They were right that the plant was powerful. They were right that it required ceremony. They were right that it could not be approached casually. They were wrong about the mechanism because they didn't have the mechanism. The concept of acetylcholine receptors was not available to them and would not become available to anyone for several thousand more years. But wrong about the mechanism and right about the practice, which is, as it turns out, a fairly efficient way to manage a genuinely dangerous thing. The ceremony was the safety protocol. It was just described in a different vocabulary. The plant medicine movement of the early 21st century, which brought psilocybin into clinical trials, MDMA into therapeutic frameworks, and ayahuasca into polite conversation in wellness circles, did not rehabilitate Datura. This is notable. The movement has been, broadly, in the business of reclaiming psychoactive substances from their countercultural or criminal associations and reframing them as tools with genuine therapeutic value. Psilocybin for depression, MDMA for post-traumatic stress, ketamine for treatment-resistant conditions. The argument in each case is, yes, these were demonized. Yes, the prohibition was excessive. Yes, there are real uses here that were suppressed by poor policy and cultural panic, and the suppression cost people suffering that better policy might have spared. The argument is, in each of these cases, largely correct. Datura is not in this conversation. No research institution has published a clinical trial on therapeutic Datura. No harm. Reduction Organisation has produced a guide to safer Datura use that amounts to more than don't. No psychotherapist has proposed using scopolamine's dissociative properties for guided trauma processing in the way that MDMA's empathogenic properties have been proposed for the same purpose. The psychedelic renaissance has collectively looked at Datura and made the unusual institutional decision to simply leave it where it found it. The plant medicine tradition, which is broadly enthusiastic about the wisdom encoded in indigenous relationships with psychoactive plants, has largely accepted the indigenous assessment of this particular plant, which is powerful, dangerous, not for casual use, not for unsupervised use, not translatable to the Western therapeutic context without the full, ceremonial infrastructure of the traditions that developed it, and probably not safely translatable even then. The Chumash conclusion was specialist knowledge, structured ceremony, external, observer, controlled dose, not for everyone, probably not often. The 21st century clinical consensus, arrived at through entirely different methods, is do not administer to human subjects. They reach the same place. The Chumash got there 3,000 years earlier. They got there because they'd been watching, and because, unlike most of the Western frameworks that followed them, the Chumash framework built in the watching as a structural requirement rather than an optional precaution. What the 3,000 years of watching produced, assembled from all its sources, the temple offerings and the Inquisition records, and the colonial dispatches, and the obstetric literature, and the classified programs and the harm reduction forums, is this: a plant that makes you certain. That's the through line. Not the danger, though it is dangerous. Not the amnesia, though the amnesia is total. Not the delirium, though the delirium is complete. The certainty. The medieval woman, applying the ointment in the night, was certain of the experience she was about to have, the experience she was having, and the experience she later reported to the inquisitors. Every layer of that certainty was pharmacologically produced and factually wrong and felt in the moment of each layer, indistinguishable from ordinary knowing. The Jamestown soldier boiling the shoots was certain they were edible. The obstetrician documenting the twilight sleep results was certain the procedure was a success. The patient reading the promotional materials was certain the procedure would be painless. The nurse on the ward was certain of something different and had no promotional literature to contradict her. The CIA analyst reading the confession was certain for a moment that they had something. The subject delivering the confession was certain they were telling the truth. The modern forum user who had read all the warnings was certain that their preparation was adequate. Every one of them was the most convinced person in the room. Every one of them was, in the specific way Datura produces, right about their certainty. The experience of certainty was completely real, and wrong about its object. The certainty was the drug. The certainty has always been the drug. What makes this strange at the end of the account is that it implies something about the certainty that exists outside the drug. Not that Tuesday is in doubt. Tuesday is fine. The floor is solid. But the floor is solid because the system that reports on the floor is functioning correctly, not because the floor has been independently verified. The system is a very good system. It is the product of evolutionary processes that have been refining it for a very long time, and it is reliable in the ways that count for most of what you will ever need. You just cannot step outside it to check. You have only the system's word. Most of the time, this is sufficient. 3,000 years of Datura's history is, among other things, a sustained documentation of what happens when the word is revoked. When the system's report is replaced by a different report, and the replacement is clean, and there is no seam, and the person inside the replacement has no idea. That person was, depending on which account you're reading, a woman applying ointment in medieval France, or a soldier in colonial Virginia reaching for a plate of greens, or a woman in a German maternity ward, or an intelligence operative in a classified program, or a person at home on a Tuesday evening who had read all the warnings and was completely certain they had taken a careful dose. All of them were in the same place. None of them knew it. That's the plant. That's always been the plant. The plant is still growing. Right now, in a vacant lot in a city somewhere, or along the margin of a highway, or at the back of a suburban garden, or in a field in South Asia, or in the hills above what used to be Jamestown, Virginia, the whites. Trumpet flowers are opening after dark, or the seed pods are drying, or the seeds are on their way to somewhere new. The pharmacology is not updated. The alkaloids are the same ones that produced the Sabbath Confessions and the Beverly Account and the Twilight Sleep Wards and the CIA budget line and the 40 phantom cigarettes counted by a sober friend in a notebook that the other person will never read because they won't remember being there when it was written. And somewhere, this is essentially certain, someone is planning a careful dose. They are not uninformed. They have read what there is to read. They understand this is not like other things. They are the most prepared person they know of who has approached this substance seriously. They are absolutely certain. This is the thing that Datura has in common with nothing else. Not the danger, not the duration, not the alkaloids, the certainty. Every other dangerous substance produces in the person taking it some signal that the substance is present. The altered perception, the physical sensation, the unmistakable quality of being somewhere other than sober. Most drugs introduce themselves. Datura doesn't introduce itself. Datura replaces you with a version of you that doesn't know a replacement happened. And that version goes about its business, talks to people, performs tasks, smokes cigarettes, moves through the world with complete and natural confidence, while you're elsewhere, or nowhere, or filed in the gap where Tuesday used to be. The witches knew they flew. The soldiers had no idea what they'd been doing for 11 days. The women woke up and a baby was there. The CIA got confessions that were entirely invented and delivered with total sincerity. The forum writer opened their laptop and spent 3 hours trying to reconstruct 3 days from a neighbour's account and a text message they sent to someone they can't remember texting. They were all the most convinced people in the room. They were all gone. They were all absolutely fine. The plant blooms at night because that's when the moth comes. The moth is the pollinator. The white trumpet flowers are white and large and fragrant in the dark because white is visible to moths in low light, and the fragrance carries on the night air, and the moth comes, and the pollen transfers, and the flower's purpose is served. This is the whole plan. This is the entirety of what Datura is doing. White flowers in the dark. Moth arrives, pollen moves, seeds form, seeds spread, plant continues. Everything else, the alkaloids, the delirium, the 3,000 years of documentation, the Sabbath confessions, the Jamestown soldiers, the twilight sleep wards, the classified programs, the Erowid reports, the sober friend counting phantom cigarettes in a notebook the other person will never read, is incidental to the moth. The caterpillars don't get to eat the leaves. That's the alkaloid's job. Everything else is collateral. The plant is running a tight, focused operation, and it has been running it successfully since before the word successful existed in any language. The humans, with their acetylcholine receptors and their ancient hunger for experiences that exceed the ordinary and their persistent, completely specific, entirely human certainty that they are the one who finally understands. The humans are not in the plan. The humans are the margin. The ditch by the road where the plant grows is the margin too, which is fitting. The plant didn't reach for the human nervous system. The human nervous system reached for the plant. It has been reaching for the plant in every culture that ever found it, across every century since the first person looked at the large white flowers blooming after dark and thought, "I wonder." And the plant bloomed in the dark as it always had, and said nothing, because it is a plant, and it had no idea. The strange part isn't what you see. It never was. It's that you never question it, and neither does the plant. It just keeps blooming.